Okay. We're glad to have George Bullard leading us today in our discussion. I've sent out, I think, all the bio material about him and the books he's written and so forth. But personally, I'd like to thank him for decades. I've read a lot of his material and used it as director of missions here in Chattanooga, working with the churches. And so I'm just grateful for the insight and the vision and the evaluation that he's made through the years of a lot of our work that has been very helpful to me, I know, and as I've shared it with churches, have been helpful to them. So, George, we're going to turn it over to you and let you lead. Appreciate your doing that today.
Glad to do so. Thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity to share. And I want to do some sharing of some stories that I hope will engender stories from each of you, as you have experienced a lot of what I'll be talking about in your own ministry over the years. And so we need to hear each other's stories about things. Now, the title is I'm working on some material about what happened to your church. And I'm couching it in terms of life that is typical, conflict that is periodic, and trauma that is systemic. My particular focus throughout all my adult life, even at seminary, was not so much how these impacted personally people, but how they impacted systems. And so I've spent most of my adult ministry in consulting with systems, with congregations, with denominations, with parachurch organizations. We really did not have a tremendous amount of material that might point systemically towards trauma in organizations until more recent years, particularly as neuroscience and psychiatry both have been able to contribute significantly to this arena of work. And so some material that I began putting together up to 40 years ago now is able to be modified to talk more clearly and specifically about what happens to trauma at high intensities or how it's visited systemically, even though we know there are individuals in the church, even in the greatest days, that have personal and family trauma that they would indeed experience. Often they are not necessarily visited, at least openly, on the life and ministry of the congregation. I do want to do a little background. I basically became interested in conflict mediation initially during my THM process, actually my D.Min process, where I sought to find out and to talk to nationally recognized consultants like Lau Schaller, Ezra Earl Jones, Ted McKeechan, but particularly in this case, Speed Lease of the Alvin Institute, about how their process of consultation worked. And in talking to Speed Lease, I became very interested in some of his information, and so have developed a friendship with him. And last time I talked to him was back in about February or March of last year. He's retired in on the coast of California. And but there was an opportunity early in the 1980s when I was on the staff of the former Home Mission Board in the Associational Missions Division, when each of us were asked in that division to take an area of specialty that we could apply to the work of Baptist associations, because virtually outside people could not apply their work sufficiently into the crazy culture of Southern Baptist life. And so let us become the experts, let us learn from outside experts and let them use us. And so I chose conflict management for Baptist associations because I would readily admit that how to handle conflict was a challenge for me. So I thought this is a good growth area for me in terms of my ministry. And so I began taking training from Speed Lease, soon discovered that my great professor and colleague and friend, Larry McSwain and Bill Treadwell, were working on this whole area too. And so by 1983, we were providing training for associational directors of missions in the summer conferencing at Ridgecrest and Glorieta with week-long seminars on how they could work on conflict in their congregations and in their association too, as the conflict in the Southern Baptist Convention was heating up. But very quickly, we realized they needed not only the introductory things that I offered, but they needed also what Larry McSwain and Bill Treadwell had worked on. And so we involved Larry and Bill in Coming to Glory and Ridgecrest also over a series of years. Intermediate in there, we had Speed Lisa around, and we had, I've forgotten the fellow out of Oregon that we had, but on congregational systems, but those were some good years of learning. But it was not until 1989 that I particularly was asked to do any kind of major significant conflict mediation consultation with a significant Southern Baptist congregation. Now, kind of leading up to that, I'd like to tell 3 stories, and one will be a little bit of the story of that church, and then introduce the chart that has been sent to you, and then open it up and let us have conversation. What are you seeing in it? What are your experiences? What are some of your stories? I said earlier that I felt like that there could be individuals, including the pastor, in significant trauma, which did not necessarily cause, in an open sense, trauma to rise to the surface in the life of the congregation, but yet the trauma of the pastor could impact the congregation in various ways. The first story is extremely personal. When I was 14 years old, and my father was pastor at Gregory Memorial Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, I would sit on the back pew with my friends, and we would pay attention sometimes and not pay attention sometimes. And on a particular Sunday, my father ended the worship service about 10 minutes before the top of the next hour. That provided a great opportunity for my friends and I to go out in the parking lot and have a longer time to play before we all had to go home, perhaps. Until a man came up to me and said, "George, your father is sick. You need to go check him out." And I went running into the church, upstairs into his office, which was behind the sanctuary. And my father was sitting at the desk crying uncontrollably. And my mother and my adult sister, one of my 2 adult sisters at that point, were around him, and some of the church leaders. You know, I'd been oblivious to what had happened. What had basically happened was my father burned out in front of the congregation in the middle of his sermon. He just got to a point where he couldn't preach anymore, and he stopped. He called for the invitation hymn. We sang 1 verse. He closed in prayer and turned around and walked into his office and cried. 2 days later, he left home for 7 weeks. It was not to leave us. It was to go to seek help, because he realized something was terribly wrong. And he went to North Carolina, went to the Baptist Hospital at Winston-Salem, and North Carolina was our home state. He had many family members and friends there. He had a full physical. He had a full psychological mock-up. He entered into a routine of counseling. He received some medication, and a sidebar of that medication is that he was not able to preach without medication for the next 3 years. And he traveled around North Carolina visiting family and friends and playing golf with a couple of his brothers. And about 7 weeks later, he was ready to come home. And he re-entered our household. And it was my same father, but it was a different father. He was having trouble with his re-entry in terms of what was going on. The church loved him. He had been there 8 years. It hadn't been necessarily unrocky. It was a tough church. It was a church that had become heavily a cultural congregation and not really one that was pursuing spiritual directions. And so my father had really transformed them over a period of 8 years, but he burned out in doing it, primarily because of the expectations he placed on himself as to what excellence looked like. And that's, of course, something I acquired too. in terms of being his son. 6 months later, we moved on to Philadelphia, and my father had 13 years of the greatest years of ministry in his life because he got the help he needed. The church loved him, and they were able to make a relatively smooth transition to the next pastor in terms of what happens. Story number 2. There's a series of 3 churches in a given community in the Southeast, all whose names it's a 2-word name, ends with Creek. There's Porter's Creek, there's Black Creek, and there's Cedar Creek. Well, actually, all 3 of these churches were known as Battle Creek churches. And when new people moved into the area, if they had a network among Baptists, it was suggested, you don't want to consider any of the Battle Creek churches, that's for sure. Well, the particular church involved here, the Cedar Creek Church, was more than 100 years old. It had been a rural church. It had developed a pretty strong culture within it over a period of years. But as they became a rural urban fringe to a suburban church, they were resistant to all these new people moving in. They were resistant to the neighborhoods coming in. They were resistant to new people who would join and wanted to change the church. And so over a period of time, a power block developed. And the power block would really do whatever they could to run off new people who came, who wanted to do something different. Their business meetings were known as hymnal events. What that meant was they would throw hymnals at each other across the sanctuary during the business meetings. About 2 to 3 decades ago, they had become so suburbanized that there was going to be a new road put in right through their community, the old Cedar Creek community. It was going to be a 5-lane road, 2 going each direction and then a turning lane in the middle. It was going to come right in front of the church. Why would we want that? They and the property owner across the street went to court and fought it. So the road actually went a block above them, and their road became a 2-lane road, farm to market road that only went for 2 blocks and ended. But they also felt like, well, we need a new sanctuary. Maybe this will attract some of the right kind of people. So they built a new sanctuary. They did it
unmuted.
very cheaply, not with quality. And they did it in spite of the fact their other 2 buildings were crumbling and falling apart. Well, about 7 years ago, they realized they really needed to do something different. And they needed to find the right pastor who would revitalize them. So rather than doing as they typically did, because they had a revolving door of pastors, they decided to go out of state and find somebody who didn't know their reputation. And so they found someone who identified himself as a revitalization pastor. And said, and so they entered into a contract with him. They not only called him, but they had a contract that he would be a revitalization pastor. This is what they wanted him to do. Please come help us. Without him knowing, as a relatively young pastor, that they wanted to call a pastor who would come in and restore past glory, but not change anything about the church. We've seen that. How many times? Their name is Legion, for there are many. In the process, to make the story relatively short, they entered into a futuring process. They got to the point of voting on it, and the power block of old line leaders were totally opposed to it, of course. But they had not involved themselves in the futuring process because they liked to lead from the sidelines rather than from the center. And so they were getting ready to have a vote on it, and everyone knew it was going to be contentious. And so one of the things that had happened to the church right before the pandemic is that they had had a study committee to study their bylaws. And in the bylaws, it indicated their active members and inactive members, but it had never defined them. In defining inactive members, they defined them as people who had not attended for at least a year and or had not given financially for at least a year. So when they came to the vote, they knew that there were people coming out of the woodwork who hadn't attended the church for a long time. And so they had the administrative assistant, who was not a member of the church, sit at in the vestibule and check in everybody. And if they were on the active list, give them ballots. If they were on the inactive list, they didn't. They also brought in an outside moderator to moderate the meeting. And when the vote was taken, the moderator and the administrative assistant counted the ballots at the front of the church in front of everybody. Their bylaws called for a 2/3 majority to pass what was in their future story, and it missed by 3 votes. They backed up and went at it a different direction, voted again a month later, and it passed by 3 votes. And they proceeded to replant the church, basically to dissolve the corporation and to do a radical replant until the sideline power block took them to court and sued them. 4 plaintiffs. The one who was funding the lawsuit had not attended the church since the 1980s. And the process went on for a year and a half. Now, this church was known, as I indicated, one of the Battle Creek churches. It was known as the church, and I could take hours on it, that had tremendous trauma in the life of the church and had tremendous harm that they had done systemically and personally to many, many, many people in the life of the church. Story number 3, then we'll be finished with the stories, and we'll open it up to hear any that you would like to. There's a church, and I want to indicate to you that there are some of you that will be wise enough, perhaps, to figure out what church this is. That's not of consequence. I'll not name the church. It doesn't help the story, but the story itself is sufficiently powerful on the whole issue of trauma that we need to hear this story. A pastor had been at this urban church, a Baptist church, for 2 decades. Already in this particular church, more than 30 years ago, the SBC controversy was a divider. There were groups in the church that leaned SBC. There were groups in the church that were leaning away from SBC. This was a very large church. The management of the church was sufficiently complicated that at a particular time, this church had changed its bylaws to create within the deacons a set of administrative deacons. It didn't work. What happened was it created different power and control bases. Among lay people, there came to be, according to their bylaws, 3 very powerful people. One was the chairman of the administrative deacons, one was the chairman of deacons, and one was the church elected moderator who could call a business meeting of the church anytime he wanted to. It was a typical situation where the pastor had been there 10 to 12 years. The confidence in his leadership had begun to wane. So he took the track of calling a younger associate pastor and giving him a fair amount of authority to handle certain things. And over the next 10 years, there became senior pastor devotees and associate pastor devotees. The church was splintering in regard to that. The pastor typically took the month of August to plan his sermons for the next year. One particular year, he was taking a 6-month sabbatical after he'd been there again about 2 decades. And so he was away, not where he typically went. The controversy was such that during the summer, while he was primarily gone, the moderator of the church called 3 business meetings of the church for dialogue, not for voting on anything, at a cafeteria in the community. And the only people who knew about it were the people they wanted to invite. One afternoon, an early teen, not preteen, but early teen young lady who may be sopping wet, was 100 pounds, was walking 2 neighbors' dogs, both of whom weighed more than 100 pounds. As she got near to the main road that divided their neighborhood and the church was on the other side, the 2 dogs grabbed her, got spooked by something, and grabbed her out into the road. She was blindsided by a car and died on the street, as the church staff stood on one side of the street and the neighborhood people on the other side of the street. Her family were one of the close devotees of the associate pastor. When the pastor heard about the event, he knew about the 3 meetings that the moderator had called in the cafeteria. He insisted and flew home and said, "I will do the funeral. I'm the only one who does funerals here." Although there had been other funerals done while he was away on sabbatical that he did not come back for. The family of the young girl, even before the funeral, confronted him with multiple charges of what had gone on with him. After the funeral, things continued to grow and to grow and to grow to where finally the pastor decided he had to resign. But he didn't resign quietly. He had all of his extended family come to town, sat him down on the front row of the church, and resigned. Within 2 weeks, all the major ministerial staff at the church resigned because they were being blamed for being on the other side. Within another 2 to 3 weeks, a major storm came through the area and power was out for 48 hours, but a church-wide business meeting had been called for the purpose of their bylaws required them on senior staff, the church, to vote on their resignation. An interesting wrinkle. 500 people without power gathered in the sanctuary for a 5-hour meeting and voted to accept the resignation of the senior staff and to reject the resignation of the pastor and recall him as pastor. The night before, I had met with a special committee of the church that knew they needed to bring in a conflict management consultant regardless of how the votes went. And so within the next week, I put together a team in a church this large. Over a period of time, we did 40 focus group interviews to help people talk and to unpack what was going on. One of the key protagonists of the conflict had shared a golf course locker with the senior pastor for 20 years. The senior pastor went to play golf one day and found out he had a new golf partner. And this person wouldn't let go. The pastor did everything he could to make amends. He went and spent several hours, 3 or 4 hours with this man and his wife on New Year's Day. One night about midnight, his personal coach and I were sitting in his office, talking to him, helping him work through some things. And he mentioned the fellow and he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." He's had 3 major heart attacks. He about died each time. 2 weeks later, in the conflict management process, we had a group meeting of about 50 people. There was a test as a part of it to see how the group would handle things without me present. And so I stayed for about an hour, and then I left to go home. And after I left, this protagonist stood up and berated the pastor for 20 or 30 minutes without stopping. Some of his friends finally calmed him down, and he said, well, you all can have it. I'm going home. And he went home and died of a massive heart attack. It was then that we were able to get not resolution, but we were able to mediate something that would be acceptable for them to be able to move forward. The pastor agreed that he would resign and retire by a certain date. He actually retired a year and a half before the date that we agreed on. And the church sought very carefully to move forward from there. Wasn't easy. It was rocky, as at least one person here really knows. Part of the issue was the moderator. We allowed the moderator to be elected for one more term of 1 year. And then after that, he could never be moderator of the church again. The trauma was phenomenal in terms of how it played out. There have been some very good years since, but the trauma has always been just there right underneath the surface. Now, so the issue becomes one of, it's not just about how do we help churches deal with conflict, because conflict and dealing with it is probably more an event. How do we help churches deal with trauma that is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, so that they can have the kind of future that God would intend for them? Let me stop at this point, and not necessarily for you to react to any of those three stories, but you may be glad for you to. But to say, what does this engender in your heart, soul, mind, and strength of what you've seen about our churches, and how we might take a look at that? And then a little bit later, we'll show the chart. Who would go first?
If you want to speak, you'll need to unmute yourself, please.
What is your story? Do you feel in our group of friends that you can share your story? The first one's the toughest. Who'll take the risk?
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
One story is fairly brief. Again, a church I won't name that essentially terminated 3 of the last pastors I knew anything about. You did a consultation with them. And they continued to decline and decline until they were at a point of having to make a decision about their future and how were they going to do that process-wise. One of the deacons asked if he and the pastor could meet with me. And I learned from that process that he was the primary problem in the church. But he blamed their situation on George Bullard.
Yes.
Because George had identified him as the problem. And he remained the problem. And I just say that to say there are no easy outcomes to congregations that get to what George has identified, I think, marvelously as the trauma level conflict churches. A second quick story. The last church I attempted to do a conflict intervention with was one that had actually terminated each of the previous 3 pastors. And they were trying to terminate the one they had called the previous year when I was asked to assist them. What I learned was that most of their conflict was based on community politics. That the opposing leaders were on opposite sides of the fence within the school system. And they had fought battle after battle in the school system and carried it over into their church. It's the only church I've ever worked with where deacons cussed each other out in the deacons meetings where we were trying to mediate. And on one occasion, threatened each other to step outside and settle the issue physically, which we prevented and it didn't happen. Needless to say, I discovered that the major source of toxicity in that church was a longtime secretary who was on one side of the conflict and constantly fed confidential information to the leadership, resisting any kind of change in that church. I consider my work as a failure in that church because I don't think we changed a thing. And that's simply to say anybody that wants to step into the arena of conflict consultation, it's a challenging job and no one does it better than George Bullard. I think that's enough for me.
Thank you, Larry. It was interesting that the church, that first church you mentioned, the 3 times they terminated a pastor, every time they terminated a pastor, their attendance went in half.
Yeah.
And it started at 2,000. And then it went to 1,000. Then it
You
went
know
to
what I'm talking about then, don't you?
Yeah. Then it went to 250. Yeah.
And they
Yep.
also had an ex-pastor who ran everything behind the scenes.
That is correct. That is correct. Who would go next?
I'll confess my sins. George, you led a conference in Nashville about 20 years ago. You may remember it was scheduled by the state convention, and it was on church development kind of thing. And I was in the midst of controversy in my congregation, so I attended. You did not fix me. And then I did not fix the church. But it's interesting. Something I didn't know about was that the church that started during the middle of World War II, and it is a military town, people came from everywhere. And it's sort of a characteristic of the city. It's not just my church. It was a lot of churches in town had a similar history, that everybody wanted the church to be like the one they left behind at home. We even developed here a practice of that really kind of caught on around the country, is having a funeral in the evening and burial the next day, because the burial had to take place 100 miles away in the city we came from. But that sort of thing in the background. But what I've learned over the years, and actually it wasn't until I left, is that every pastor the church ever had, and that is true today, was in controversy, and his resignation was demanded at some point. And there was always the same practice. Somebody would call a prayer meeting. Select people attended the prayer meeting. In my case, one of those people was one of my best friends who was in the church, who's also a doctoral graduate of Southern Seminary, Lee Morris. And he was uninvited to attend because they decided that he might not be a good person to have in the meeting. But this is kind of characteristic went on. Only one pastor was not driven out. He died of a heart attack at the height of his ministry. I still support the church. I had a good reputation in town. We started another congregation. That's a no-no, I know. I struggled with it. It wasn't a Baptist church. We were interdenominational. But people in the congregation were sick of it and were leaving anyway. And so we gathered together and reformed a church. It's interesting, to make the long story short. I'm retired now. We closed the congregation because I buried most of the members over the years. I spoke at a community service during Holy Week, and at the First Presbyterian Church, and there was pretty good attendance there. And one of the members of that congregation I had left said, "I want to talk to you when this is over." And so in the reception period, we got over to the side. She was always very friendly. And she said, "I just want to tell you something." I said, "You should have left, and you still need to leave." And I just want you to know that I have acted like I have supported you. And remember, I took you out. My husband and I took you out to dinner and all this sort of thing. Yes, I remember. And I still don't know what to say, but I just sat there and said, yes, agreed with her. But I told Wayne Ward when he came here for his sister-in-law's funeral, I was laughing after this was over. I said, well, I've only been fired once in 40 years, and now I'm 53. I still have only been fired once, but I don't know very many pastors who haven't been through this kind of crisis. And it will tear you apart. The main reason I came to the point of resigning was I didn't think my health would hold up long enough to see this through. It was in the middle of the controversy, the Baptist controversy, the battle, and there were sides in the congregation. I could find all kinds of things in there, but all of the books that have been written on how to fix congregations were wasted on me. But I'm still in town and love it here. It's a good town. And I've joined the First Presbyterian Church. I have a good pastor. I am sorry. I wish I could help, but I stay away. I keep my distance from the congregation. The new pastor is a fine young man. He graduated from McAfee. Is doing a good job. Now, I'm hoping the church will recover. But Selah.
Who would go next? Chuck, I don't know if you were trying to talk or not, but you're muted.
So let me check with my technician.
You got it. You got it.
You're on.
I got it. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. I was going to tell a very personal story. I'm not sure I've ever really told this story to very many people, but I was pastor at First Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, until I was 46. And probably in spite of me, the church was doing very, very well. We had grown from 950 to 1,300 in Sunday school. Of all things, for a moderate church, we were in the top 10 in baptisms in Georgia, is listed in the Christian Index. I want to talk about what I think was some trauma that had been a part of the church, but I also want to talk about how that trauma caused me to make a couple of critical mistakes. The deacons met and they voted to give the staff a 6% salary increase. The deacon chair wasn't at the meeting. I called him, he told me that his car wasn't working. I never heard from him for 15 days until we had the finance committee meeting. He was also the chair of deacons and the moderator. The first thing I heard from him since I had called him was he stood next to a person on the finance committee and he said, "Chuck, I'm with them, not with you." I was absolutely devastated because the church had gone very, very well. That's when I made at least two critical mistakes. One is I didn't factor into all of this that even though I'd been there over 6 years and things had gone well, I was still the guest in town. People in Augusta is the second largest metropolitan area in Georgia, but that's like saying, compared to Atlanta. And a lot of people had gone to school together, had grown up in the church together. And I discovered very quickly, even though I thought I'd given my very best to that church and had done it when my son was very ill and had worked through that and done some other things. And I made that mistake because we had a church conference. All of the staff, all of us were stashed in the basement. I had no idea what the vote was. I came out to find out that I had lost what I wanted. I wanted to increase to go with what the deacons had recommended, but the deacon chair didn't even let me know that he wasn't in agreement with me. The other thing I made a mistake was I should have recognized that if you're going to go to battle over something, you really don't go to battle over money, and particularly over salaries. Because I was getting a very small slice of this $10,000 that we had recommended. Our budget was $2,500,000. But as Diane and I walked into the meeting that night in Augusta, I heard somebody say, he's just interested in money. I knew at that point that I had lost, I miscalculated, and I had failed to factor in that this church had a history and people who were friends with each other and who had gone to school with each other. And regardless of whether they liked me as a pastor or not, they were not going to go against the people that they knew. And so I lost. I'm very thankful. A month later, I had a call from Larry McSwain about coming to teach at Southern Seminary. The best thing that ever happened to me, Larry, because of all the things I needed. I was just worn down at that point. And the change of pace, even though it wasn't the best time to be a professor at Southern, the change of pace was absolutely renewing for me. But I got sucked, and I didn't get sucked in. I did it. I made mistakes that I should have recognized some of what was really going on in this whole process. And, you know, it's taken me a while to get over some of the resentment of that. I mean, it really took me a long time to get over the resentment because I had given that church everything I had. I mean, it wasn't a job, it was a calling for me. And I had made some tough decisions and I'd gotten, you know, some negative feedback on it, but I'd done it because I thought it was for the good of the church. But I discovered if you're going up against people who've been to school together all of their lives and lived all of their lives, and you've been there 6 years, you're still the guest. And I made that bad mistake because I didn't realize that.
Well, you know, Chuck, it's amazing the number of churches out there that are repeat offenders and that go through cycles and who have ongoing trauma just underneath the surface that it sometimes takes us a while to figure out. I remember a really early consultation in Maryland where I was working with the church. Supposedly it was strategic planning, but no, it was conflict under the surface. And I interviewed 34 people individually. That was back when I did individual interviews rather than what Speed Lease taught me to do group interviews. And so you could get the interaction. But the 33rd interview, I asked a person, I said, what is it about this group that meets on Sunday nights? Because I can't get anybody to tell me. And she said, oh, they're charismatic and they speak in tongues. You know, and you just, you know, at the tail end, you find out about it. You know, you hadn't yet known. I'll ask this question in terms of what happens. But no, Chuck, I feel for you. I simply say this. I still communicate with Tim Owings weekly because some years later, I went there and did, again, a strategic planning process for First Augusta. But it was about 18 months to 2 years before Tim was gone following that particular experience also in terms of what happens. Someone else who would go? We've got time maybe for one more, and then we're going to shift gears and talk about the 7 intensity process. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Anybody else comes on, I regret I'm going to have to leave in just a few moments. I'm sorry, George, that I'm not going to hear all of this, but thank you for what you've shared.
Glad to do so.
We can post it online later so friends can see it.
Okay.
George, a couple of quick stories and a couple of little interesting insights. A lot of what I did over the years, working with Union Association in Houston, and before and after, involved strategic planning. And a couple of really unfortunate experiences I had were total surprises. In 2 large churches in moderate-sized towns, what seemed to happen was wonderful planning processes. I mean, these took most of the year. They involved lots of people, all these kind of focus groups, a lot of data gathering, a lot of energy. Pastors were both just sharp people. And in both of those cases, after the planning process, after all the recommendations were done, after I'd ridden my white horse off into the sunset, you know, celebrating everything good that happened, the power blocks then stepped up. They had held back that whole time. Maybe they were involved in some of the conversations, but obviously neither I nor either of the pastors knew, you know, that that's what was going on. And in hindsight, you know, you can see other dynamics. One pastor followed a very beloved pastor and they never made the adjustment. One of them was a first church, both were first churches. One of them was a very strong mixture of folks on both sides of the controversy that were just, you know, moving along on the surface. So what I'd say about that is reaffirming what you described. The people that are often misusing the power and willing to go to the next power level for destructive purposes play their cards very close to the vest and only step in, you know, when they need to keep the control. And that's, you know, the very opposite of a healthy kind of a system. It reminds me of a very powerful lesson I learned from John Savage. Some of y'all may have done training with John over the years, and he would continually say, you know, healthy systems screen out unhealthy people and behavior, but unhealthy systems will screen out healthy behavior in people. And you know, I was thinking, Chuck, even when you were talking, some of the things we do sometimes that seem like mistakes, they could have just been reasonable things, even healthy things to do, but the system was not going to allow that kind of stuff. You know, we do secrets here. We don't talk about things like that in public. And you know, it's easy to get a Messiah complex and say that anything I did wrong was in fact, you know, just healthy behavior. I have to deal with that. And then I'd add one of my funniest little stories coming out of these sort of deals was I was overtly working with a very small church one time that was at odds with the pastor. And one group had a mixture of people for and against the pastor, and setting the ground rules I had been very, very clear about. Now, the fact is, you know, all of us only see part of what's going on, and we all bring our own histories and so forth. So when we start to say what we see is going on or our opinions about it, what we're really sharing are our perceptions. So we're just going to identify and claim and acknowledge, you know, we see through the glass darkly. This is just our perceptions. So we started around the room, people telling, you know, what they understood to be the situation. And finally, we got to this sweet great-grandmother type lady who says, well, now to start with, Brother Furr, I want you to know, these are not my perceptions. This is what really happened.
Well, James, always we have to remember in conflict that perceived truthful information is always more powerful than the truth. Discovering the truth will not manage or resolve conflict because perceived truthful information is always more powerful than the truth. And so that is a key piece. And I'll say for me, and it applies pastorally also, my greatest fear in ever working with a congregation about their conflict is, you know, that which is hidden. That is to say, what is it that I don't know that I don't know? You know, and if unless I can figure out what it is I don't know that I don't know, I could very well do harm to this congregation. In my particular case, and we'll make the transition to the chart in just a minute. I always did a signed contract that the congregation as a whole had to vote on. That would give me the authority to make any recommendation that I saw fit that fit the data that I had developed, including firing staff and including firing lay people from their roles. The The other thing is I always had a non-suit clause in there that they had to vote on, that they would not sue me for my engagement with and my activity with the church. And if they did determine that they'd break that and they were going to take legal action against me anyhow, that they had to adjudicate it in the county in which I lived, which meant they had to hire an attorney there. They couldn't force me to go to wherever they were in terms of that kind of thing. When I started doing these in 1989, my wife asked me, said, don't you think we ought to put the house and the cars in my name if you're going to do these kinds of things? And I said, Betty, what is your job? And she said, well, I'm the weekday preschool director at such and such a church. And I said, yeah, we're going to put the house and the cars in my name. One of your teachers is going to slap a kid and we're going to be in real trouble in terms of what happens. So, well, let me share this screen and let me therefore then show you the model. And if you know how to do it, you may have to minimize the pictures you see on the one side there, but Speed Lease always had a thing called 5 levels of conflict that he developed in the late 70s, early 80s, which was a very helpful piece at that point. But as with everything that we've learned over our life, there are progressions of things. And so by the mid to late 80s, I was having dialogue with him about the fact he used to talk about low level 3 and high level 3 and nonviolent 5 and violent 5. And I said, Speed, you're really talking about 7 levels of conflict. And he said, yeah, I know, I admit it. But he said, I've been doing that so long, I don't want to go back and try to redo people. I said, well, what if I did it? He said, that'll be fine. So I took his 5 levels of conflict and put them into 7 intensities of conflict with his approval. The book I ultimately published on this was not published until 2008, and he endorsed the book and said, you know, you got it right, and this is what we need to do. Part of what I've decided now in my retirement, I retired last June 30th, is that that book, which came out in 2008 and thus has been out 14 years and continues to sell, I reached an agreement with the publisher that we would withdraw it from publication, and then he returned to me the fully edited manuscript. And so my intention now is to say, you know, there are a whole lot different issues that are dividing churches these days, and there is more we know about the whole issue of trauma and how that works not only individually but systemically, and so that you know the material is really not as relevant and the applications not as clear as they once were. Like, for instance, when I wrote the manuscript actually in 2007, there wasn't the need to address the LGBTQ issue quite as strongly. But by 2010 to 2012, that was becoming an issue of virtually every congregation. The one that I worked with that Larry made reference to, that was an underlying issue in that particular congregation. And it was coming out particularly in deacons meetings and stuff like that because of the number of people who had family and friends who fit various definitions of LGBTQ at that particular time. And so in thinking about how to redo this, I've determined that what happens at the highest intensities or the strongest intensities of 5, 6, and 7 really speaks to some kind of ongoing trauma stuff that we need to further understand. Now, a background, I began reading now about 5 or 6 months ago in all the trauma literature. I've indicated, I think, that a working title for this work is What Happened to Your Church? Life, Conflict, and Trauma in Congregations. Well, there is a book, if you're not aware of it, called What Happened to You? And it's by a fellow who has a PhD both in neuroscience and in psychiatry. that talks about the trauma, particularly even prenatal trauma and life trauma early on in life, and how that impacts and things that go on. His name is Bruce Perry, and it's a very powerful book. And my wife and I have been able to see some things in our own lives and in our children's lives and in our grandchildren's lives as it comes out of that and relates to that. Bruce Perry is also the author of a book, a co-author of a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And it says, and other stories from a child psychiatrist notebook. And that's also a very powerful thing about what traumatized children can teach us about loss, love, and healing. One of the books that's been around for a few years that still rates in the top 20 in the paperback category on New York Times. In the New York Times, it came out in 2014, and it's still in the top 10, is entitled The Body Keeps Score. The Body Keeps the Score. By Bessel van der Kolk, K-O-L-K. And the subtitle is Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And if I recall correctly, about 4 or 6 months ago, there was a presentation to this group that referenced the book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. My Grandmother's Hands. There are a few books I'm finding out there that is trying to deal a little bit with the theology of trauma, but nothing that's really trying yet to deal with the systems. And I don't pretend to be a person that will be able to help necessarily with the systems. Maybe more trying to identify and help us to understand. But if you're able to see the chart, and I know the chart's been sent to you a couple of times by email, so you might be able to reference it later. The book that I originally wrote was entitled Every Congregation Needs a Little Conflict. And part of the reason for that title is that typically congregations don't try to learn about conflict and how to address it until the conflict is already so severe and they have no coping mechanisms. And so my concept was in writing that book that if congregations during lower intensities of conflict would learn the practice of how to work through that conflict, that they would perhaps be in a position to either A, know how to handle some of the conflict as it heats up, or B, know when they're not able to handle it and they need to call in a third party to help them handle it, and see how not to repeat the pattern if it does get out of control and go into unhealthy conflict. So I've identified that typical congregational life is intensity 1, 2, and 3 conflict. I mean, we have individual things that are going on with us. We have disagreements with people at intensity 2, and we have a competition within a group or between groups. In fact, my wife and I, due to still being called by the church where she was the weekday preschool director every once in a while for advice and counsel, got a call the other day about the fact that the weekday preschool has built up a reserve fund because it's got to replace playground equipment, it's got to replace this, it's got to replace that. And the church is not doing as well financially as they had once done. And so they're salivating over the preschool's reserve fund. And I said, well, you remember, we dealt with that 30 years ago and held the church off to say, no, this is different money and this works differently. And it was a conflict between the finance committee and the personnel committee and the weekday preschool committee. And I happened to be personnel chairman at that time, and my wife was the weekday preschool director, but we worked through it within the church at that particular time. But I suggest that those first 3 intensities of conflict are healthy. They're going to be happening all the time in the life and ministry of a congregation. And if we know how to, if we get some training, some education, and we've got generally reasonable people, we can work through virtually every intensity 1, 2, and 3 conflict that does occur in a church. But if we don't know anything about it, or if we are the kind that are in denial, then we may mess it up, and it may escalate. And I'm calling in the draft, and this is totally a draft of a new chart, that the intensity 1, 2, and 3 conflict is typical congregational life. But at intensity 3, there's an overlap. It may be about the process of becoming periodic congregational conflict. Like, for instance, the large urban church that I referenced earlier, it was possible to say that early in the pastor's sabbatical that the intensity was still 3. It was not going to stay there, but and probably didn't over the summer. But what happens to many a pastor is that, you know, for church members, it's their church, and they feel like they got a little extra coping mechanisms. But also for people outside the core, they can go to another church. But for us as pastors, it's our livelihood, it's our reputation, it's our calling. And so a pastor who is confronted by intensity 3 conflict tends to overreact, and when he or she does, escalates the conflict to intensity 5. And therefore, the pastor may not have been the main issue of conflict when it was at intensity 3, but when it escalates to intensity 5, the pastor is the focus of conflict. And the pastor gets whiplash and says, what happened? You know, what happened to make this possible? So I suggest that the idea of periodic, true congregational conflict that is in the process of being unhealthy can begin to emerge at intensity 3. It is in full blown at intensity 4, and it is at a lose-leave place in intensity 5. But what happens in intensity 4 is that people vote. They vote with their shoes by presence or non-presence. They vote with their pocketbooks by giving, not giving. They vote with their soul by believing 100% in their church and what God is doing in their church, or withholding that. They vote with their words, by how they talk about people inside and outside the church, in the community, about the church in terms of what's going on. I think perhaps the most controlled ongoing conflict I've ever seen in my life, and I really will not name this church, is a church I was meeting with in a southeast city where we were doing strategic planning, and the executive pastor said, I need for you to go to this one meeting that's not on your agenda. And I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, this is the secret executive committee of the church. It is chaired by a retired man who shows up at church about once a month. Otherwise, he's up in his mountain villa. And he has been chairman of the deacons, chairman of personnel, chairman of finance, chairman of trustees throughout his life, off and on. And he handpicks who's going to be the chairman of all 4 of those, still yet. And the meeting is with him and those 4 people. And the pastor will be there, and I will be there, and they will deliver their decision about what will happen or won't happen in the life and ministry of the church to the pastor at that meeting. Interestingly enough, that was 23 years ago, and that pastor just retired last year. He gave into that, dysfunctional as all get out. It worked, and the church has thrived in terms of what's happening. Now, by intensity 5, the conflict is unhealthy. There is no congregation in existence that I know anything about who can handle intensity 5, 6, and 7. And by the time you get there, either the collection of or the synergy of the various traumas that have gone on in the lives of people play out almost publicly in the life and ministry of the church. It is at intensity 5 that churches split, pastors and staff get fired, new churches are formed. It is at intensity 6 where lawyers are brought in, and there are lawsuits, perhaps lawsuits. I kind of hate to say this. Part of the issue is I one time had my sister and her husband are members of St. John's Baptist Church in Charlotte, and have been for many years, and off and on. I mean, they moved away from Charlotte and then moved back. And I remember when Tom Graves was there before he went to BTSR, he said, "Lord George, if I ever hear that my deacons are talking to you, I'll go ahead and resign right now." But and I said, "Well, Tom, it's not that bad. It's just we got to be willing to work through it." But I hate to say it, but I did have the one church I gave the example of where a layman died of a heart attack in the midst of it all. And I had another church where a layman died of a heart attack because the church was being run at the country club. And they hired the country club people hired a woman to lie about one of the church staff people, and the church staff people found out about it and filed lawsuit against the attorney that was in charge of that group. And the next Saturday, the attorney dropped dead of a heart attack in his driveway. And so I've always said since then to people, listen, conflict is a real life and death situation. We aren't playing here. It's a real life and death situation. So if you allow conflict to get to 5, 6, and 7, because there was not intervention before, yeah, there's a possibility somebody's going to die. But intensity 6 is where lawyers are involved and there is legal action happening. Intensity 7 is where you have to bring in law enforcement to separate people. It's where church buildings are burned down, which doesn't happen much, but it happens in some sociological communities more than in others. That there actually are, the pastor's home is set on fire, the church is set on fire. But the reality is hardly any conflicts go beyond intensity 5. But once it gets to intensity 5, the whole trauma message can take over in the life and ministry of the church. So I think we're at the point where we've got to do more work on what is the visitation of corporate or systemic trauma in congregations. And we particularly have got to do it also, and this will be a final statement, open up for comments and questions and perspectives and disagreements. I'm glad for any of that. With the polarization of our society, politically, socially, culturally, that has happened now over the last dozen years or so, we're in a time where even though churches are more segmented now, maybe by what position they hold, but we're in a time where the trauma that comes out of a polarization that is visited on churches because of polarization and trauma mixing together can be very, very, very significant. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point so that we can see each other again and see if what questions or comments you want to share about that. Does this make sense to you at all? What and perhaps there are things you want to speak into about it. Wallace Williams, up in the Northeast, you never had any church situations or staff situations like this, did you?
Ignorant.
Excuse me?
I said I was conveniently ignorant. I was covering so many churches, as you know. We grew, and I was traveling all over South Jersey and all of Pennsylvania, and so many of the churches were just at a very fragile grouping stage. I really worried about the churches because they were so severely underfinanced. And so I appreciate the Home Mission Board and working with Roy at that time, who had helped us a lot with churches. So anyway, churches would disappear sometimes, and I wouldn't know it. We just see all of a sudden in our monthly income that we hadn't heard from such and such church, and they just gone out of business, or they had split, and nobody said anything to us, and no communication. I discovered several pastors who were very, very much in trouble with the law and had persuaded people to take them on as pastors. One man I'll never forget, he wrote the home mission board and said we did not give them enough money to be as successful as they wanted. He had all kinds of good records for baptisms and people joining. And it turns out that his wife's parents were in that church. And even though he was 5 states away from that, in his start in ministry, he just thought we ought to just celebrate that. And he wanted to report us to the home mission board. But what the real issue was, that he had had a severe automobile accident. The Pennsylvania police decided to run a picture on him, check on the books that they had. And it turned out he had an active search warrant for possibly killing his wife in Texas. He was working with his 3rd wife. Now, George, that probably happens in other states, but I wasn't prepared to deal with outlaws. But we did call him down to the State Baptist building, and we sat him down in the conference room, and we read the riot act to him and told him he was as good as gone, and we were going to recommend the home mission board. He'd get absolutely nothing from them. They sent out somebody to check, and there was a standing arrest warrant for him in Texas. So, yeah, it was interesting. Different kinds of conflicts coming on, and the more we had the beginning polarization that was happening and impacting all of us didn't really hit the Baptist Convention in Pennsylvania, South Jersey until we reached 25,000 and got representation on national committees. Then people running things would never run through the executive office about, would this person be a good committee member? They would appoint them and buy them off with several nice paid trips to Nashville. And they'd come in and start fussing at me that I had dared to say something good about a Sunday school board director or something. And how could I say that? And they'd show me stacks of paper being collected on all the leaders in Southern Baptist Convention. These are sometimes people as high as 25 years of age working with 12 people in a congregation, and they'd been appointed to national committee meetings. And that was the beginning of the end of having control of anything at our state. We couldn't tell what was happening. My successor was very effective, David Waltz, who stayed 23 years, and he knew a lot about Pennsylvania. Every time he heard about a meeting going on, he would invite himself and call up and tell them he thought the state executive ought to be present too. That stopped a lot of meetings. It was a different kind of responsibility.
Yeah.
And we had some wonderful churches too, and I was grateful to be a part of one of them, Country and Town Church, where Chuck was, not Chuck Bug, but Chuck T. And anyway, it was an interesting responsibility. It was also some of the most significant days of my life. We had some great meetings. We had a state evangelism conference where there was a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit that was absolutely one of the strongest, most important experiences I ever had in my life. And we didn't have any stem-winded preachers from Texas. We didn't have any 100-member choirs from the church singing. We had about 300 to 400 people at Memorial Church in Gettysburg who would come for the state meeting. And we had, as leaders of that meeting, we had Henry Blackaby, Avery Willis, T.W. Hunt, and Ron Owens. And they led us in prayer and quietness, and people who need to come forward for 4.5 hours. And that caught fire. I got to go around to a lot of churches after that and reference that. and pray for them to get down on their knees more and to stay out of all the subterfuge that goes on in churches, if possible. But anyway, they knew my number and called me if they had problems, and that I tried to respond and help if I could. Gosh, George, your dad was important, as you know, in our convention, and after Joe
Waltz.
Walsh was appointed first state executive after just 1 year of service. I think he died of a heart attack out hunting somewhere, as I recall. And we didn't have terribly long-lasting people. And right when I left and I was called to be director and starter of a new degree program at Beeson Divinity School, I talked with the executive committee about who was my best recommendation to immediately jump in and take over even as interim. And it was David Waltz. And about the end of the time there, you know, he was Mensa, and he was Princeton graduate and a Princeton football player and a very successful pastor who started a church from zero and had it grow in a good, healthy way up in north central Pennsylvania, and where the Little Leagues always held World Series. And he did a great job as far as I can tell. And was there 23 years, and that really helped. By the way, there were a wonderful group of Ukrainian churches there. And my heart goes out to them as I think about the terrible things going on today. But around Philadelphia, they were very strong. And we even had a Ukrainian staff member, John Kovalchik. You may or may not have known him, but he helped us a lot. Anyway, didn't mean to talk so long, but that was a very rich experience for me. I told Judith after 5 years, I thought if I had to drive 35,000 miles all over the countryside again every year and take plane trips in between to Nashville for things I didn't necessarily like to hear, I thought I'd be dead in about 5 months. And when the state executive group finally was taken over by state conventions who followed their good, wise, bright state executive and started putting fundamentalist choices in, it changed the whole nature of the state executives. And that was my last straw. I didn't have anybody I thought I could talk with candidly and pray for each other and mean it and not keep our fingers crossed. Anyway, but George, you've done a wonderful job, and you were in the middle of conflict. And I'll tell you, I don't know where things were at that point. I'm not even sure I understood what all you were doing. I heard good things about you, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. It's probably saved the sanity and careers of a lot of people, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you. Someone else.
Long answer, not asked for, but you asked me to report in. Thank you.
I did.
I could share something if y'all can hear me.
Yes.
I came to Southern Seminary in 1968. And then in the late 80s, I did the D.Min, and Charles Chandler was my field supervisor. I was living in Illinois at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, by the way, today is my 55th wedding anniversary, and some of you might remember Nolan Howington. He did my wedding, or our wedding, in Knoxville 55 years ago today. But what I wanted to mention was just after I had finished serving a church in North Carolina in 2012, I was still living in a small community in North Carolina in Warren County. And our local Baptist association called a new director of missions. And he had recently been terminated in Charlotte, North Carolina. And some of you or somebody there may recall that happening. I could mention his name. but he had served in Charlotte, I think, very effectively for a number of years, and felt very unjustifiably terminated. And when that happened, he thought about it and then brought a lawsuit against the association, or at least some of the people there that were involved in the termination. And then as he came to our association over east in the state, not far from Henderson, where I lived off Interstate 85 and close to the Virginia border, Warren County border, Virginia. When we interviewed him, he indicated that he had dropped that lawsuit and that was not active. But then once he began to serve in our association, he reactivated the lawsuit. And that brought up a great big firestorm of controversy in the association. And of course, the lawsuit didn't involve anybody in the community. None of the people in the churches where he was beginning to serve as the DOM were involved in Charlotte, but it brought up a lot of controversy. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that when that all broke open, the moderator resigned of the association, and guess who was the vice moderator? It was me. And suddenly I found myself on the hot seat, and I became the moderator and had to deal with that. And all of that went down 10 years ago. And ultimately, some of the worst of some people was brought out, and the new director of missions was terminated by a vote of the church representatives in the association, and he lost that position there. So I'm just sharing that to say that conflict can occur in that context as well as in churches. Just thought I'd share that.
Oh, it definitely can, and it does visit in all dimensions of our denominational life and whatever group we're currently affiliated with, and we have to remember that. One of the things that happened when we were doing the training at Ridgecrest and Glorietta of Associational Directors of Missions in the 1980s, they would invariably in the class say, well, hey, talk to us about the Southern Baptist Convention controversy in relationship to these 7 intensities of conflict. And the key principle I always said was, whoever is willing to go one intensity higher than the other group is going to win. And so the group that was willing to go one intensity higher won. And so moderates were too nice if they wanted to win. Anything else?
George,
Yes.
could you give us the name of that book you mentioned? The Body what now? I need to write it down.
The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score. The subtitle is Brain, Mind, and the Body in the Healing of Trauma.
Thank you. I wish before Chuck got away, I could ask my question to him. And that would be, how many pastors since he left that church have they had? And I can think of at least 3, maybe 4. I think they're on number 4.
Wade's holding up the book right now, Larry.
Okay. Thank you, Wade.
Yeah.
And there's one other pastoral care man that I'd like to mention with regard to this. Ernie Izzard has a PhD in pastoral care from Southern, lives in Texas, and he has an organization called Trauma Ministry, and he's trying to put together processes for trauma groups in local churches in Texas, and that might be another resource.
Good.
And a lot of the trauma is basically abuse of children. that he's focusing on.
Mhm.
And thanks for today.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot.
George, I'm back from a chest x-ray and they think I'm going to live. But
Good.
you mentioned this book also, My Grandmother's Hands. It's dealing with racial trauma.
Right. Yes, I think I mentioned it while you were gone. Maybe I didn't know if you heard it or not, but yes. I mean,
Okay.
because you had mentioned that, or it was used about 4 to 6 months ago in our talking together, I believe. Yep. David, I would say at this point, I am glad to have other discussion. I'm glad to stay on till the 5 o'clock hour, but I'll leave.
George, may I ask a question?
Why, certainly.
And again, I apologize if you've already covered it. I don't know if you've talked about the current controversy in the Methodist Church, but in my CPE program, I have 4 Methodist students. 3 of their churches have voted to leave and become Global Methodist, which is the more fundamentalist group. But the members are staying, the pastors are staying with the Methodists, and it's affecting ordinations. And I don't know if you've talked about how, I don't know whether to call it the rippling effect or circle effect. Out at Miniger, they talked about trauma being like dropping a boulder in a pond and it goes on out. It can, and what happens on the outside comes in and it reverberates in trauma theory. The Methodists internationally are in conflict, but I've dealt with 3 Methodist pastors in the last week who are in tears and devastated and losing their churches, will be reappointed someplace. And have you talked about any of that and the relationship of system within system within system?
No, we haven't. We haven't gotten that in depth. Obviously, what's going on in the United Methodist Church and the new denomination is intensity 5 and 6 conflict. It is in the trauma level. People are, losing their very soul in regard to it. You may know about the greatest of brother against brother as the Jones brothers, the one that's president of Belmont. And then his brother Scott, I believe it is, Greg Jones at Belmont, and Scott Jones is now going on Truett's faculty at Baylor, and he resigned as bishop and joined the global group. And so that's so there's family conflict there, there's church conflict there, there's spiritual integrity conflict there, there's people who are concerned about their own personal eternity. I've lost my church. Have I lost my Christ? It'll go on for, well, we know it as basically former Southern Baptists in the sense of, you can really go back to start at 79 if you want to, but I think you go back and start at about 61, 62. And so we're at 60 years now in terms of where we are. So it'll be a 50 to 100 year impact on the Methodist Church. And virtually everybody will have to die from this point forward, this day forward, before it'll be better. At least that's my opinion. I think the trauma is long lasting, and that's one of the reasons why I've been so heavy over the years of saying, we got to do conflict education. We got to help people understand that typical congregational life, that we can learn some of the skills that'll play us better. But if we deny the need to learn those skills, then we're going to be in a mel of a hess, when we get to a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. I would just add, George, thank you for giving so much of your life to this very difficult kind of ministry. It's exhausting to be a part of those kind of processes, whether you're the pastor or the intervener or whatever. And I think what you've done to Speed's piece has been helpful, and all the things that you continue to do. So, appreciate that very much.
Well, I have to say that when Bill Treadwell was probably mid-60s, and I was right about 40, he would do conflict triage and then have them call me in to do the process. And I said, why don't you do the process? He said, I'm not healthy enough to do the process anymore. He said, I can't do it at this age. And I would acknowledge I have not done a full-fledged conflict mediation in 12 years. I've done a lot of work about conflict, a lot of training about conflict, but I'm 72 now. And so about the time I hit 60, I said, I don't really want to do this anymore. But Larry just kept on doing it.
Not that much. By the way, one of the better resources, as I understand, and I don't have a lot of detail here, Eastern Mennonite University, I believe it is. The guy from Chicago, David, he did had a urban ministry up there. I can't remember his last name, but he has put together a very effective training center. And I just read recently that Lilly had funded some major resources for them to do training. It's another center, I think, that is a good resource for this topic.
Now that's in Harrisonburg, Virginia, at the Eastern Mennonite University. And in mentioning Lilly, those of you who know Lilly, and know that they have those pastoral renewal grants, but they also have this new thing that Duke is administering, Duke Divinity School, on reflective leadership. People who need to they're at a hinge point in life and a hinge point in their ministry or work, and want to think through the next stage of what that would look like. And so that's through the leadership program at Duke Divinity School. Dave Odom, that some of you may know, would be an attachment for that, or a contact for that. Well, David Myers, again, I'm glad for us. And if anybody wants to just say, hey, I want to talk to my friends a minute, I don't feel the need to pontificate on anything else today, and see where you all want to take it. I don't even see Dave on the screen. Andy, is he still on, just not on the screen?
He had to leave. He told me to wind things up. So if you're done, we will stop the recording. And if somebody wants to stay around and chat a few minutes,
I'd like to say one thing. Hasn't Peter Ray Jones been signed up to do the Sermon on the Mount in a coming session? Anybody know the answer to that question? Peter Ray, are you or you can respond? Huh? He's doing it in May?
Hey, we're not having a meeting next month.
Okay.
Hey,
we need to have a huge crowd for that one. He has spent, I think, 10 years working on the Sermon on the Mount, and it's going to be a rich presentation.
Well, we look forward to that. Thank you all.
thank you, Andy.
Bye.